With an elevation of 4,000 meters above the sea level lies Tibet, the land of snow, popularly known as the roof of the world. The highest plateau in the world, covering an area of 85,000 square miles. Tibet is surrounded by China in the east and north, Nepal, Bhutan, Burma, and India in the south and west. There are many stories or theories relating to the origin of the Tibetan people. The most famous of them all, which the Tibetans associate their origin, is that a male monkey, manifestation of Cheresik, the Lord of Compassion, married an ogress, manifestation of Tara. Through this marriage, they had 6 hybrids. From these 6 hybrids, the Tibetan race is believed to have been originated. Tibet's history dates back more than 2,500 years. According to early historians and scholars, the first king of Tibet was originally from India, and he is said to have been in Tibet somewhere in the 5th century around 127 BC. He had lost a battle in India and escaped over the Himalayas into Tibet. There he met some shepherds and cowherds grazing their cattle in the field. They were the followers of the Bon faith, which existed in Tibet before the emergence of Buddhism. On being asked where he came from, he gestured towards the mountains, actually meaning he had come from the other side of the mountains. It seemed to these people that he was pointing towards the sky. Since Bon practitioners, being worshippers of nature, considered the sky sacred and thought he had descended from the sky to lead the people, they made him their chief. They placed him on a wooden saddle and carried him on their neck. He came to be known as Nyotitsempo, the neck-enthroned king and the first king of Tibet. It was only after the 8th king of Tibet that credible history was available. But in the 7th century AD, Tibet saw the zenith of its power politically and spiritually under the 3 religious kings of Tibet, namely Songtsen Gampo, the 33rd king of Tibet. He ruled Tibet from 617 to 698 AD. A few decades after him, Trisung Dezin, the 2nd religious king, ruled Tibet from 742 to 798 AD. Rinpoche, the 3rd religious king of Tibet, ruled from 806 to 841 AD. He was the 41st king of Tibet who was assassinated by his brother Langdharma. Langdharma was the 42nd and the last king of the Yalung lineage. During his brief rule, he persecuted Buddhists to such an extent that Buddhism literally vanished from Tibet. But he himself was assassinated by Lalung Pelge Dorje in 846 AD. In 1207, the Mongols invaded Tibet. The Mongols' encounter with Buddhism began during this period. This was a boon for Buddhism, and in the 13th century, Buddhism made its reappearance in Tibet. Genghis Khan adopted Buddhism. Later on, his successor, Prince Godan, also carried on with the spiritual relations with the Sakya Lamas. His son Kublai Khan converted to Buddhism and nominated Sakyapantita as his nominated king of Tibet in 1249. Between 1247 until 1350, 20 Sakya Lamas ruled Tibet. But with the collapse of the Mongol dynasty in 1368 marked the end of the Sakya supremacy in Tibet. The 14th century saw the rise in the Gelug sect. Altan Khan, then the ruler of Mongolia, was so impressed with the wisdom of the 3rd Gelug leader, Sonam Gyatso, that he conferred the title Dalai Lama, meaning Ocean of Wisdom. He was the 3rd Dalai Lama. He ruled Tibet from 1543 to 1588. From then, Tibet was ruled by 9 Dalai Lamas in succession till 1875, when the 13th Dalai Lama succeeded as the ruler of Tibet. His time saw an invasion by the British in 1904 and then by the Manchu Chinese in 1910. However, with the collapse of the Manchu dynasty in China in 1911 gave the 13th Dalai Lama the opportunity to return to Tibet and expel the remaining Chinese troops and officials from Tibet. From then until his death in 1933, he maintained the independence of Tibet and kept off foreign influence in Tibet. The 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Wangden, was born in 1935 and was recognized as the true reincarnation of the great 13th Dalai Lama. At the age of 5, he was enthroned in the Potala, but being a child, the responsibility of the administration of Tibet was placed on his representative, the regent. Meanwhile, in China, a storm was gathering, and ultimately in 1949, the Manchu dynasty was overthrown and the People's Republic of China was proclaimed by the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong. In 1950, when China started invading Tibet from the east, the Tibetan National Assembly requested the Dalai Lama, aged 15 then, to assume absolute power. On May 23, 1951, a Tibetan delegation which had gone to Peking to hold talks with the Inquisition was forced to sign the so-called 17-point agreement on measures for the peaceful liberation of Tibet. With threat of more military action in Tibet, they were forced to sign the 17-point agreement under duress. The Chinese then used this document to carry out their plans to turn Tibet into a colony of China, disregarding the strong resistance by the Tibetan people. The Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama were invited by Mao Zedong to China in 1953, and during the meeting he promised that China would not invade Tibet but simply liberate the people of Tibet. And once the liberation was complete, the Chinese would leave Tibet. But more and more Chinese troops were being sent into Tibet. The Tibetans in the eastern province of Amdo and Kham were being harassed by the Chinese troops. In many places in these provinces, villages were being looted, people were being killed. Out of desperation, the Tibetans in these provinces took up arms and began to resist the Chinese invasion. Eventually, independent resistance forces began to form in almost all parts of Tibet, which ultimately gave birth to the first resistance united under one banner called the Chushi Kantruk, spearheaded by Andrugtsang. It was evident that something terrible was going to happen. On March 10, 1959, a unified resentment for the Chinese gained national momentum, and this led to the first and the bloodiest national uprising in Tibet's history. A severe crackdown by the Chinese resulted in the death of 430,000 Tibetans. The Tibetan people pleaded the Dalai Lama to escape into India. With a heavy heart, he was escorted safely by the Tibetan resistance force into India, and along with him, about 100,000 Tibetans fled into exile in India. In 1966, the wind of cultural revolution blew over China and it overflowed into Tibet. Thousands of monasteries were destroyed. Out of 6,000 monasteries and temples, only 13 survived. Thousands of Tibetan men, women, and children were being sent into labor camps. More than 1.2 million Tibetans died as a direct result of the Chinese invasion. The Tibetans never in their wildest dream dreamt that once their forbidden land would this day be forbidden for them too. McLeod Ganj, famously known to the tourists as Little Lhasa, is a small town in the northern India. His Holiness the Dalai Lama moved here and established his exile government in the early 1960s. Initially, the area where it stands today was covered with forests. Along with him, thousands of Tibetans moved to McLeod Ganj and made it their home. They have been living here for the past 4.5 decades. McLeod Ganj is a mixed community of local Indians and Tibetans. Hundreds of tourists from other parts of the world and from within India flock to McLeod Ganj with many reasons. Some come here to study Buddhism, many to explore the Tibetan people and its culture, and yet others come here as ordinary tourists. The Tibetans here have been able to preserve their culture and traditions more fervently than the Tibetans in the other exile community in India and elsewhere. Majority of the Tibetans living here in exile in India are doing well. Tenzin Wangden Andrugtsang is one such Tibetan living in exile here in India in McLeod Ganj and owns a small shop.
My personal reason, I think non-violence is also very good, and the world recognizes the Tibetan as a follower of non-violence, But I think if we had a little bit of more, little bit of violence, like in India, you had violence and non-violence. So I think it would move. I think we would have good press coverage also, and the media would know about Tibet more than as it is now, like in PLO. I don't mean to say like blow up planes or something like that, but at least if you have more active, people can see that Tibetans are doing something. Instead of just always like 10th March, just go for a procession. The next 11th March, everyone is busy with their own work. So it just becomes it's like a birthday. Like every year, just once, it happens once, and that's it. So there's nothing like reminding us that we have to do it. It should be within us every day of our life. Every day when we get up, we have to think that we have to get Tibet back, So we should do something. So non-violence has, I cannot say it has not proved anything. The world knows Tibet now more than what it used to know about Tibet, just because of non-violence through His Holiness the Dalai Lama, But I think we still need to be more aggressive, a little bit more, what do you call? Not exactly a rebellion, but at least something more aggressive, something more concrete. I meant to say that,
Gyaltsang Pinsok is the president of the Tibetan Youth Congress. Tibetan Youth Congress is a non-government organization with over 50 regional offices and over few thousand members in India, Europe, the US, and in many other countries. The sole aim of the Tibetan Youth Congress is to strive for a complete independence.
There's nothing wrong with the middle path as such. Middle path is basically one of the most beautiful things. Should be acceptable to everyone. But when we talk about the middle path for the Tibetan struggle, there remains a big questions. It's like taking anacin for different illness. Anacin may be very good for the headache, but at the same time you cannot generalize this for other sickness. It can be harmful. Same way, middle path for the Tibetan struggle, taking into considerations the response that you response and the thinking mentality of the Chinese authorities and the real situation today which we are facing. It is not the best, and it is not the one which will solve the Tibetan issue. We don't believe that this is the ultimate, the wishes of the Tibetan people in general. Today, Tibetan people support autonomy, middle path, because His Holiness Dalai Lama said so. It's my fear, or our fear, that day when Dalai Lama is no more, we are left with no leader, no personalities who can really convince people that there is something in middle path. Therefore, I must say that we look at middle path as something which is very wonderful, but doesn't really fit with us and doesn't have a future in Tibetan community.
Middle path
There are people who feel that the middle path approach expressed by His Holiness the Dalai Lama is not making much progress and that we need to adopt another approach. But I feel that we should stick to the middle path approach and work more on how we can achieve the aim through this approach and what we should do to make the middle path approach more effective. I can think only of just one other option when we say that we need to adopt a whole new approach other than the middle path, that is, a complete independence for Tibet. But looking at the economic control of China in the world scenario and the current international political scenario, I think talking about complete independence for Tibet will not help but harm our struggle. By this, I am not saying we don't wish for an independent Tibet, but we need to analyze the situation and accordingly act. So what we need to do is to work harder to make the middle path work. It's been some 4.5 decades since we lost our independence. But even though our goals of achieving our independence has not been realized yet, we need to know that what we have achieved so far has to be credited to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and on our part by following the path he has shown us, the non-violent path. I fully support the Dalai Lama because I believe in non-violence myself. I do not expect Tibet to be free in 5 or 6 years. As compared to a history of a country, I feel 50 or 60 years is nothing. If I cite an example, the country we are living in right now, India, was under the British for 200 years, which finally became independent. Maybe Tibet might be free in 1 or 2 years, or maybe in 10 or 15 years, or who knows, it might take 100 or 200 years. But if we continue with a non-violent approach as shown by the Dalai Lama, and eventually in some point of time, when we are a free nation, then I think it will set an example to the rest of the world. It will show the world how powerful non-violent movement can be. But there are some fractions in our society who believe that non-violent nature of a struggle is not bearing much fruit, and that the Tibetans need to adopt a more aggressive approach. This is acceptable, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama has always said that the Tibetan government is a democratic setup and every individual has the right to put forward their views, to exercise the right to expression. And he himself has always been open to criticism, be that from outside or from his own people. I feel that the need of the hour is not to argue on which approach is the best to free Tibet, but rather to preserve our rich culture, tradition, religion, and most importantly, our identity as a Tibetan.
In the West, when they help us, many of them, I believe, and I'm sure, do not expect something back. They want to be friends of Tibet, and when they come to the teachings of His Holiness and some Lamas, they get some inner peace, which I think is more important than the material. Which, as you know, life is ephemeral. We are born and we die. But when you have the inner peace and the good life that you live, you always enjoy it. So before you die, you think, oh, I lived a good life. So if you just make a lot of money, and when you die, you have to leave all that back. Then before you die also, it's always a problem. You don't have that inner peace. So West, when people come into contact with Tibetans, they get that inner peace. They come to teachings, they learn a little bit of Buddhism. I heard, if I'm not mistaken, in some schools in the West, they are like atheists. They don't believe in religion, but they feel that some of philosophy should be inducted into their curriculum. The Buddhist philosophy, I meant, which they feel is quite and sometimes which science cannot teach or cannot explain Buddhism has the answer. So these are some of the things the West can gain from us, and we can teach them.
Now these days, that since the economic conditions of the Tibetans have become more stable, and now we can now the conditions have improved a lot. So I think that now these days what we need more than the financial support, financial aid, what we need more, the most wanted is the political support from more and more independent countries.
I do not have expectations from the West. In fact, it is wrong to expect for others to do things for us. We lost our country for many reasons. One is we were weak. One is China was so powerful. So we also had our own problems, internal problems. We were not united. We were divided, in fact, in Tibet also. So there are many reasons. You cannot just say oh, Chinese took over. No, we have to look back and look at ourselves. What did we do and how did it happen? So there are many problems also. So now it is very important that first of all, we Tibetans should be united. And we should have this pride that I'm a Tibetan, and then understand that my sense of belongingness has been snatched. If you don't feel this, then maybe you are happy here also. Maybe you are happy somewhere, another country also. So you should have these qualities first, that I'm a Tibetan, I'm different from other people, other races. And my sense of belongingness has been snatched. And because of this, I have no country today. I'm living in exile. And at the same time, I'm not called a refugee. I'm a stateless person.
I have been teaching in this particular school for the past 5 years. Majority of the children in this school, being new arrivals from Tibet, tend to be a little better in Tibetan considering the performance in the English subjects. They are quite poor in English. After an intensive course in various subjects for 4 to 5 years in the opportunity classes, they are admitted into the different level of classes according to their ability. I, being a social studies teacher, see the problem they face with English, as I have to teach in English medium. But seeing their determination and endurance and desire to learn really urges me to work hard for them. And I realize that the problem I face seems so negligible, seeing the hard work these children put into their studies.
Now, since there is only 1 year left before we graduate, I feel both nervous and little bit happy, because since our lower classes, we felt that when this schooling year will end, and we were very much excited. But now that the school is about to get over, we feel very much nervous than happy, because once out of school we have to face the reality, and we have to be in the society, and we have to be on our own self, and there will be no teachers to guide us. After school, I will be doing mass communication, and then after completing my courses, I'll be joining some jobs. But why I have preferred to choose that job is because I heard that in the Tibetan community, the people doing that kind of job is very few. So I thought that if I do that kind of job, if I learn some courses in that kind of job, then I can, instead of instead of other people's working in our community, we can have our own people. That's why I opt for that.
A lot of Tibet critics and people feel that Tibetan culture and its struggle has and is being overly romanticized in the West. If I agree with this, then I would be saying that whatever has been portrayed in the West through books or photos or through films are not true. If we compare our culture and religion with other countries, it is really different. So whatever has been projected in the West of our culture through these mediums, I feel it is true. For instance, when I am watching a Tibetan opera performance, it creates a world, a different world, which is our culture, the Tibetan identity. I romanticize this moment with myself. But then a photographer comes in between this world and me. It suddenly totally distorts or shatters the feelings and my attachment to this unique world I see and which I am experiencing before me. So I feel that the romantic attachment to the Tibetan culture is there, and I think it is true, and I feel it has not been overly romanticized in the West.
Miss Tibet pageant was criticized by one of the most influential Tibetan person. He is none other than our Prime Minister, Professor Samdong Rinpoche. His point was that pageantry is un-Tibetan and it is nothing but aping Western culture. Say this, and to counter this point, I have to talk about a culture a bit. What is Tibetan culture as a whole, as we see today? It is a combination of so many different cultural aspects from so many other parts of the world, especially our neighboring countries. China, for example, for food, clothing from Mongolia, philosophy, literature from India, music from Kashmir, painting from Nepal, statue making from Nepal. There's so many things that has come from other neighboring countries. So one thing comes, if it is good, Tibetan people accept it, it retains in the culture, then we say, like, after some time we say it is our culture. So for example, football is a good example. In early 20th century, football came to Tibet. And the monks, especially the monk community, the clergy at the clergy level, they said, kicking a football is kicking Buddha's head. So it is not suitable for Tibetans, so it should be stopped. So there was so much criticism. And after 50 years, today in exile, we have a Tibetan Football Association endorsed by Tibetan government in exile. So Miss Tibet pageant or beauty pageant is again a very new thing. It will take another 50 years for many Tibetans to understand it and to incorporate this into Tibetan society, in Tibetan culture. So likewise, when new thing comes, everybody's cautious. And our Prime Minister, especially when he has a huge responsibility, when he has to think of everything from saving our culture, from promoting Tibetan culture, from educating young Tibetans. So he has a huge responsibility, and because of that, he became overcautious where the Tibetan youth are heading. So in a way, it was a good, inspiration, encouragement for us to cross-check ourselves. Are we doing this right thing? Are we doing in a Tibetan way? Are we doing, something good? So we had to reflect ourselves this way, so it was good. So we especially, I was never discouraged. In fact, it gave me more power, more energy, and my future ideas for Miss Tibet is so strong, and until wherever I can carry it on, I will do it. And the objectives of Miss Tibet pageant, why? Why we do this? First of all, again, there is like total lack of women's participation in artistic field. There's also lack of platform for Tibetan women to, even if they knew something, there's total lack of a platform for them. And it's a very important medium for them to say how they feel, what they want to do in future. And it is also an idea for to provide them opportunities such as education, such as cross-cultural experiences, travel. So it has very good objectives, and the medium is very good.
Departure from a known environment often causes a population to lose its culture and transform its traditional lifestyle. But the unshakable determination of the Tibetan refugees has preserved their religion and culture in exile. Since coming into exile, thousands of Tibetans have been scattered throughout the world, but majority of them settled in India. In India again, the Tibetans were scattered in the country, with most of the community coming into existence in the south of India. It is as important now as it was in 1959 to maintain the Tibetan way of life in the refugee settlements and communities. Few settlements or communities arose in the northern part of India. About 76 miles from Dharamsala lies a small but a holy pilgrimage site for Buddhists called Rivalsar or Tsopema in Tibetan is associated with Guru Padmasambhava or Guru Rinpoche, a great Buddhist teacher originally from India. Here in Rivalsar, there is a small community of Tibetan refugees. Ayang is one such Tibetan refugee trying to make a living here in Rivalsar. Ayang, a recent arrival from Tibet, is from Ganj, a region near Chamdo in the eastern province of Kham. At the age of 16, she was married off to a family in Lhasa. But with the hope for a better and free life in exile, she decided to escape into exile in India in 1993. With a small loan from the monastery, Ayang and her husband were able to start a small business. Presently, she along with her husband runs a small restaurant here. Many independent and foreign countries are helping the Tibetan cause. It is my hope that the international support for Tibet is not temporary but consistent. To know that Tibetans have no right in their own country and understand that Tibetans have no basic human rights in Tibet. Tibet was forcefully occupied by China and that Tibetans in Tibet are not happy under the Chinese oppression. So I thank all the supporters of Tibet and pray that they continue to support Tibet and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Ayang is optimistic that with the growing international support for Tibet and for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Tibet will regain its independence. It is my belief that we will regain our independence, especially by considering the fact that the representatives of the Tibetan government have gone to China to discuss the issues of Tibet. And I think the visit has been successful. Moreover, Tibet is getting a lot of international support, and Tibetans themselves, especially the non-government organization like the Tibetan Youth Congress, are working really hard for Tibet's independence. Till now, we have been supported by people in the West and they continue to support Tibet. But the support from this quarter is usually by small organizations or individuals. If a government of an independent country supports the Tibet cause or takes up the Tibet issue, I feel it will be more effective. There are a lot of individuals who are Tibet supporters and who are world-famous personalities. If these people could come together and move the people and the government to help Tibet, then I think this will play a bigger role in finding the desired and the ultimate solution for the Tibetan struggle. Tibet was an independent country with its own government, economy, language, distinct culture, and religion until its invasion by the Chinese. Following the exodus of refugees from Tibet, the need for organized rehabilitation became a matter of urgency. In the early 1960s, many as 1,500 refugees were arriving from Tibet each week. They were exhausted after their hazardous journey and suffering psychological distress as a result of restlessness and separation from their family. Due to the hot and humid climate and unhygienic conditions in the transit camps, the refugees fell ill with diseases that were unknown in the high altitudes of Tibet, and many of them died. Gradually, the refugees were sent to camps in the northwest of India where they could earn their living working on road construction. The provision of food, shelter, medical aid, education, and the means of earning a living was the immediate aim. However, in the long run, the Tibetan language, traditions, and religion, all of which were being annihilated in their homeland, had to be preserved. The Cultural Revolution in China resulted in destruction of thousands of monasteries, temples, historical monuments, and centers of learning in Tibet. The cultural destruction was almost total. The systematic destruction of ancient Tibetan culture and tradition by the Chinese was aimed at wiping out the entire Tibetan race from the face of the earth. Ironically, a fortunate and a timely escape to India by the Dalai Lama and many thousands of his people saw a new ground to nurture and preserve the already battered culture and tradition. It was here in India in the early 1960s that the Dalai Lama and his exiled people began the reconstruction of their lives from the scratch. Early Tibetan refugees braved all odds, and it was because of their sacrifice and the grace of the Dalai Lama that the Tibetan culture and identity has been preserved till this day. His Holiness the Dalai Lama saw the urgency of a school where the Tibetan children who constantly were escaping into India from Tibet needed to be educated and exposed to modern education and culture, yet preserve their ancient culture, tradition, and identity. It was then, during a meeting with the Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Nehru, that the Dalai Lama requested for a separate school for the Tibetan children. Mr. Nehru readily agreed and promised His Holiness the Dalai Lama his full support. Since the illegal Chinese occupation of Tibet in 1959, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and over 130,000 Tibetans have fled in search of political, religious, educational, and other basic freedoms. Upon coming into exile, one of the Dalai Lama's highest priorities was and continues to be providing care and education for Tibetan children, many of whom are orphaned or destitute. He believes that Tibetan youth are the main source of hope for a future free Tibet. It was then still in the early 1960s when a group of 50 Tibetan children were admitted to the Tibetan Children's Village School. This school gradually grew, and now the Tibetan government runs over 80 schools and caters to 28,000 children with the support of the Indian government and the support of international organizations and individuals. The very purpose of establishing Tibetan schools is to prepare the Tibetan children to face the challenges of the modern world, grounded firmly in the traditional values. As a result, though the Tibetans have lost their country, they have not lost their identity. However, it was felt that providing only knowledge and skill alone was not enough. Students are also supported in their inner, spiritual and moral development. Rooted firmly in their language, culture and tradition, it was essential to guide the younger people in simply being good, kind-hearted human beings. The youth today are tomorrow's leaders, building Tibet's future and contributing to its development as a nation. And it is with this conviction and through education as the means that the Tibetans strive to meet and go beyond the challenges of the modern world while preserving their language, culture, and tradition. Tibetan government has also been successful in imparting adult education to the youths who have recently arrived from Tibet, thus helping them through their transition and encouraging them to be self-reliant global citizens in this rapidly changing world. Tibet and India have shared religious commonness and culture similarities from centuries, and it was with this special bond that the Tibetans have found a home away from home in India. The need to preserve the identity as a Tibetan and the unique tradition and culture led the Dalai Lama and many thousands of Tibetans to flee the country and seek asylum as refugees in India. The Tibetans have been able to preserve their tradition, religion, and culture over the years in exile. The Tibetans in exile have been able to preserve these crafts that have been practiced in Tibet for centuries. Culture and tradition that have been passed from generation to generation, such as carpet weaving, wood carving, and thangka painting, have found its way with the Tibetans into exile. And in turn, these crafts and arts have proved to be the means of earning for many hundreds of exiled Tibetans. Out of these ancient art and crafts, thangka painting has been the most popular in recent years. Back in Tibet, the thangka paintings were usually done in the monasteries, and as such, most of the thangka painters were monks. Thangka painting was not just any form of art. The measurement, the colors, the structure of the image and its postures were all written in the scriptures, and therefore the ones who could read and understand the scriptures could produce a thangka. But in exile, the urgent need to preserve this tradition was seen, and thus with more common people emerging educated took to thangka painting. To be termed as a graduate thangka painter, one has to work under the guidance of a teacher for a minimum of 8 years. The first 4 years are spent just drawing the images on paper with correct dimensions and postures. And once a person masters this, he then moved forward to draw on canvas for another 2 years, and finally he was given the brush. Even after spending 8 years on thangka painting, he cannot still be called a perfect thangka painter. A perfect thangka painter was the one who could demonstrate with almost perfection the images from the scriptures onto the canvas. Thus the process is continuous, and the painter who comes to close proximity with perfection is termed to be a good thangka painter. One such thangka painter is Pojung Tsering, an exiled Tibetan working in Tibetan Medical and Astrological Institution. Since the relaxation of Chinese policy in Tibet in the year 1981, Pojung was one of the first batch of refugees to make it to India. Pojung spent some time in a settlement in South India and later moved to Dharamsala with the hope of being enrolled in a Tibetan school. He was then 13 or 14 years old, he is not sure. He met Kamtul Rinpoche on his journey from South India to Dharamsala. Kamtul Rinpoche was then the secretary of the Department of Religion and Culture in the Central Tibetan Administration. It was then Kamtul Rinpoche advised Pojung to take up thangka painting as his career. But on his arrival in Dharamsala, he again tried to seek admission into a school, but in vain. So he enrolled as a young student in a thangka painting class in the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives. After spending 8 years of his youth there, he successfully completed his training and graduated as a Thangka painter. He works full-time in Tibetan Medical and Astro Institution from 9 to 5, but on off days and after work, he works on his Thangkas. Pujung has been able to contact many organizations abroad and has exhibited his work in a few countries abroad and in many places in India. It has become difficult to reach the level of excellence of Thangka painters of the past centuries. One reason for this was earlier in Tibet, most of the Thangka paintings were done in the monasteries and by the monks or some high lamas who were free of family responsibilities and did not have to worry about earning a living. As a result, they could spend their whole time and concentrate on the Thangka painting. Moreover, most of them paint with this in mind that the painting benefit all sentient beings in this life and the next. But these days, it is very difficult to reach that level of excellence. The reason being that there are a lot of disturbances from the environment. These days, people are interested more in materialistic pursuit and thus they cannot give enough time to this ancient art. It becomes difficult to reach that level of excellence, but it is not impossible. If we paint a Thangka just to earn money, then I think it is a wrong approach. I'm not sure nowadays what one should keep in mind while painting a Thangka. As I mentioned earlier, that these days everyone is in a race to make money, and thus, sadly, this ancient art has also been commercialized. It is my personal view that the Western countries help Tibet just because of two reasons. One is because of our religion and the other is because of Tibet's unique culture. It is really surprising how human minds work. Some people in the West become interested in Tibet because they are either bored or do not find anything interesting in their own culture. But some Western people actually find a lot of meaning and solace in Tibetan Buddhism and the Tibetan culture. They feel that even though the Tibetans have undergone so much pain in the past and yet are so content with life and have very little worries, I think it is because of these reasons that the Western people want to help the Tibetans. It is really difficult to say whether Tibet will regain independence or not. In the near future, if China becomes a democratic country and if the people who run the government are broad-minded, who feel that by handing over Tibet to the Tibetans, it is not going to harm China, then I think that this gives the basis of a hope for a free Tibet. Otherwise, I don't see any solution to the Tibetan struggle. The world at present is so caught up in improving the economic conditions of their country, and with China almost controlling the world economy, makes our struggle harder and challenging.
Other countries, other governments, they will have their own agendas, own policies. So they will try to use every means, even if they had to use Tibet, they will use it to materialize, to fulfill their own policies, their agendas. So even if there are governments who say things about Tibet, one thing, of course, they have sympathies, but at the same time, they have their own agendas. For example, they may say a few things about Tibet, but at the same time, their business will go on. They will always be thinking about their own welfare, economy, like that. So it is us Tibetans who have to do that. Recently, I was asked when President George W. Bush, respected George W. Bush, he was re-elected, and they wanted to ask me, if he got re-elected, what will be the situation for Tibet? I mean, we have to know from past history as well. Mere meeting with His Holiness Dalai Lama doesn't mean, he will free Tibet. We had even bigger financial support, political support from the U.S. government. If you can recall the Mustang guerrilla base, it was entirely funded by CIA. And that was to fight the communist China from spreading communism in the world. They used Tibet. And after Nixon's meeting with Mao, the whole Mustang base came to an end. Why? It is not really for Tibet. We should know. Meeting with His Holiness Dalai Lama doesn't mean he will free Tibet. We cannot expect, so much from the West. It is us who have to stand by, stand up, unite ourselves, and follow the path shown by our great leader, His Holiness Dalai Lama.
West can help Tibet, of course, in a very massive way. There are 100,000 different ways. They can raise the public awareness in their own country, number one. They can internationalize Tibetan issue, and they can also raise this issue with the Chinese authority as independent nations. And they can also share with the Tibetan their expertise, their experience and their guidelines. A sincere, committed advice. More than the contributions that they can make in Tibetan community, I believe that they can do much more in their respective country. Disseminating information among their own people and making people aware of Tibetan issue, and also then help Tibetan to reach at the international level through their infrastructure. See, on the basis of my experience for last 3 years, I always believe that we live in a world where you alone cannot solve any of your problems. All the problems are interdependent. We always need someone's support. You have to lend your hands, and you have to seek other support to solve your problem or your friend's problem. But at the same time, international communities should not take advantage of the weaker community. If you look at the Tibetan issue at the international level, what you notice is every nation, however strong they may be, they're trying to take advantage of Tibetan movement for their, personal, individual country's benefit. The moment, that is fulfilled, they dump Tibetan, totally. There are many examples. You see, you have a sincere, massive support from every country in the world, say in Germany or in France or in the United States or in Canada. They would say that your movement is good, we are behind you, Chinese have committed atrocities, the human rights abuses there, But when you need these words to be set at the specific platform, no one raised these issues. In United Nations, conferences, you hardly find any countries, including India, raising the real problem of Tibetans facing in Tibet. So what I mean to say that if you want to extend your support should be unconditional. Support should be genuine. Support should not be there just because you have something to benefit out of it for your country. So my message to the whole community is, if you can help Tibet, you must help. You can help. You have ability to help. Various ways, 100,000 different ways to help Tibetans. But if you don't want to help, no one can force them. At least Tibetans are so weak and small at the moment. We are not in a position to force any country in the world to support us. We cannot force. So my message is, if you cannot help Tibetan, at least do not harm. Let Tibetan alone. You see, let them struggle the way they are carrying forwards.
As thousands of Tibetans continue to flee from their country, a generation grows up inside Tibet, deprived of the opportunity to learn freely about its own culture, religion, and language. And as increasing number of Chinese people settle in Tibet, this aim becomes more and more crucial.
Tibetans and our Chinese brothers, sisters, you see, we have I think century-old some values closer related.
Tibetans are still being persecuted, imprisoned and killed for their political and religious beliefs and for holding non-violent demonstrations declaring the rights to self-determination in their own country. Approximately 1.2 million Tibetans, around 1/6 of the total population, have died through political persecution, execution, torture and starvation. Exiled from his land and his people being tortured and killed by the Chinese had never diverted His Holiness the Dalai Lama from the path of non-violence. Upon coming into exile, the Dalai Lama began a peaceful struggle to preserve Tibet's identity and regain its independence. He has always preached non-violence, and even after suffering so much in the hands of the Chinese, he has always felt sympathy for the Chinese. He reminds the Tibetans now and then that the Tibetans must not resort to violence at any time of the struggle for independence. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has constantly signaled his people not to lean on him too much. He has told them that the future of Tibet rests on the 6 million Tibetans and not on the Dalai Lama. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has committed all of his life for Tibet and peace, and he says that these two are the commitments that he will be committed to till his last breath.
This life remain, perhaps 20 years, 30 years, maximum I think 40 years. My commitment will go till my death.
On December 10th, 1989, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Committee emphasized that the Dalai Lama in his struggle for the liberation of Tibet consistently has opposed the use of violence. He has instead advocated peaceful solutions based upon tolerance and mutual respect in order to preserve the historical and cultural heritage of his people.
lumba medo man sola lumba medo man sola kangri medo man sola lumba medo man sola kangri lumba ta kangri sama kami ma besene kodum so kami ma besene tabom kangba tsangma pela leso potala pela leso kangba tsangma pela gade ta jibu se tawa wani mi ma tsama gyami ma be poste so tawa wani mi ma tsama gyami ma be toshi